This is Critical Hit Radio. I am Johnny Raiden, and this is Ricky Juno.
Hey guys, today we're going to be reviewing an exclusive Nintendo GameCube title called Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. This was released in 2004 in the USA and 2003 in Japan.
This game is a spin-off to the Final Fantasy franchise, as it does stay true to the lore, but is not related to the main series of games. While commonly dismissed as a childish spin-off, that doesn't necessarily warrant it as a bad game. And with this review, we are going to test that statement.
The beginning of this story takes place with just a cutscene and many people gathering around a large radiant crystal. This crystal is later found out to protect the village from something called miasma.
Caravans of young warriors travel the lands to collect a liquid known as Mir, using the chalice to fuel the crystals in their villages to protect them from miasma for no scientific reason. Unlike most contemporary Final Fantasy games, along with spin-offs such as Kingdom Hearts, this game does not have voice acting. In fact, this game lacks a traditional narrative considering your playable characters are audibly mute, but not on a narrative degree. Throughout the game, your character will record journal entries about their experiences, relationships, and feats. While usually uninteresting to read, it is certainly a different way to tell a story. When starting the game, you'll pick one of 4 character races. You can pick Clavats, which specialize in defense, Lilites, which specialize in offense, Ukes, which specialize in magic, or Selkies, which are kind of the oddball class.
But that's definitely the best.
After choosing your character race, you will then pick a trade that your character's family specializes in, such as ranching, tailoring, or alchemy. Your choice of trade will determine what kind of perks you'll be granted from a year-to-year basis, such as, if you pick alchemy, your family will give you money. If you pick milling, your family will give you bread. If you pick fishing, your family will give you, well, what do you think? Fish! After you've settled with your character choices, your journey begins. Let's start with the single player. Single player can be boring, and at times, frustrating too. And by frustrating, I mean you will always be the center of attention of your enemies. This will often make you a victim of stun lock, making it very difficult to fight back. As mentioned before, you will carry the Crystal Chalice, a tool to hold the mirror you collect at the end of each dungeon. And by hold, we mean you physically have to carry it.
There is this cool effect with a partially filled chalice though, that when you walk around with it, the mirror within the chalice will slosh around and almost spill.
On top of that, there are limitations to what you can do with the chalice. Most notably, you cannot move a certain distance away from the chalice. Doing so will punish you with perpetual damage from miasma outside of the chalice's force field. Fortunately for single-player goers, you are in luck. You can have a Moogle NPC carry the chalice for you, making things much easier.
Those people that know what Final Fantasy is knows what a Moogle is. Pretty much what it does is it carries the chalice for you, and the chalice protects you from the miasma. It can also help you cast spells, although it rarely does what you want it to do.
Regrettably, you as a one-man army will probably find the single player very monotonous and exasperating.
Freaking Moogle! Oh my god!
Speaking of dungeons, unlike most RPGs released during the early 2000s, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles uses an overworld map to select towns and dungeons, kind of like the later Mario games like Super Mario World. The overworld is divided into different regions which are divided by either bodies of water or miasma streams. Bodies of water require you to pay a fairy fee for each player, and most of which are not usable till later in the game. Miasma streams, however, are the obstacle you will transverse over the most. By crossing a miasma stream, your chalice must be attuned to an elemental affinity of either fire, water, wind, or earth. Your chalice's elemental attunement can be changed by visiting a specific dungeon and reattuning it at a hot spot. Unless if your chalice is colorless, it must have the same elemental affinity as the miasma stream to cross. Miasma streams will spontaneously change elemental affinity on a regular basis over time, forcing you to take different routes throughout your campaign.
The chalice elements also protect you depending on what element you have. For instance, if you have the fire chalice, then you'll be immune to being lit on fire. So if you have a colorless chalice, even though you can cross every single stream without any issue, you'll always be burned, you'll always be petrified, frozen, you name it, it can happen to you.
As for dungeons, the levels are well varied and almost always have unique enemies exclusive to that dungeon. Every dungeon also has a unique boss battle, and no two bosses have the same strategy to defeat either. At the end of a dungeon, you are scored based on what objective you were given at the beginning of a dungeon, such as pick up money or defeat enemies with spells. The objective, however, can only be seen by plugging in a Game Boy Advance. How absurd!
However, if you play multiplayer with this feature, then it creates almost a PvP environment where you're not telling the other person what you have, but you're trying to do it. Also, you can get the treasure first.
At the end of a dungeon, you will then pick an artifact. Higher scores will give you access to better artifacts. Most artifacts will increase one of 3 stat categories: attack, defense, or magic. Instead of gaining experience like a conventional RPG, this is technically how you quote-unquote level up your character. About your character, controlling him or her is simple, but also fairly awkward. The A button is to execute your selected command, the L and R buttons are to cycle commands. Generally, the game relies mostly on one button to execute combat commands, but consequently, the multiplayer requires you to use a Game Boy Advance controller, thus having limited buttons.
Multiplayer is somewhat even more frustrating in my opinion, just because of the controllers. Usually, when you're in single player, you'd be using the traditional GameCube controller. However, for multiplayer, you have to plug in a Game Boy Advance.
On top of that, the Game Boy Advance takes at least 30 seconds to make a connection with the GameCube when booting it up.
And sometimes it'll just crap out at the worst possible time, like during a boss fight.
The basic commands consist of attacking, defending, casting magic, and using items. Attacking is very simple as you can mash the command button to execute a chain of attacks. You can also hold down the action button with the attack command selected to execute a focus attack, a long-ranged attack with additional power. Each character race has their own focus attack, varying and depending on what weapon is equipped. As for magic, casting spells are a lot like focus attacks. Magic must be charged, targeted, then released to execute. You must obtain an item called a Magicite during a dungeon to use magic. There are 6 different Magicites: Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, Cure, Life, and Clear. Magicites can also be fused together to create different and/or more powerful spells. If you tap the A button with Fire selected, you can do Disco Inferno. The turn-based combat, art style, and the absence of voice acting are not the only deviations of this spin-off to the Final Fantasy franchise. The music is radically different too.
The music is very good in this game. I really do like it. I mean, it's so different from the traditional game. You don't hear this kind of music from Call of Duty. You don't hear it from things like League of Legends. You don't hear it from any game until this point. This kind of music wasn't used in video games, and it's very beautiful and it's very fitting. The music is just makes you speechless when you just sit and listen to it.
As the savvy Final Fantasy fan knows, Nobuo Uematsu is the brainchild behind the legendary music of the Final Fantasy series. However, his work is nowhere to be found in this game. The musical score of Crystal Chronicles is composed by newcomer Kumi Tanioka. Rather than the symphonic and classical musical styles we see in the main titles of the series, Crystal Chronicles' musical style draws influences from world music, particularly Scottish and Yiddish folk music. unless if you want to play as a different character race, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is not worth playing through twice, especially if you can just replay dungeons with your first save file. In fact, it might not be worth playing through again considering your character's final build is determined by their base stats. The artifact leveling system ultimately makes the stat growth in the game the same for all characters and defeats the point of ultimate stat building. Although I personally enjoyed this game a lot as a kid, its primitiveness has become more present to me than ever.
This game has very little to no replay value. I mean, it is fun to keep playing over and over with friends sometimes, but it will eventually get old, and you already know what's gonna happen. There's no real change between two files. However, what you can do is you can mix things up, you can go to different dungeons in different order, which is okay, but it's not the best for replay value.
The only major performance flaw this game has is the delayed reception with the Game Boy Advance controller. Though a controversial game in the Final Fantasy franchise, a handful of GameCube owners, including us, do have a soft spot for it. This game has spawned multiple sequels, including the Ring of Fates for the Nintendo DS and the Crystal Bearers for the Nintendo Wii. Without a doubt, this game shines in multiplayer, assuming you have a friend with a Game Boy Advance and the cable to link it to the GameCube. Let's face it, there are way better cooperative RPGs out there. But if you own a GameCube and have the extra equipment to play it, it wouldn't hurt to check it out.
I also played this game a lot as a kid. I played it for a long time to the point where my mother knew the intro song by heart. With playing it so much, it's hard to rate it fairly. I would give this game an 8-1. The 8 in my book means that it's an awesome game, it's fun to play, but I have to give it a -1 for two major reasons, and that's the multiplayer controls, which is half the fun of the game, just because of how hard it is to replay it. I mean, you have to wait at least a year, maybe 2 years, and come back and then play it again before it's actually something new again.
I give this game a flat 7.0. While playable, it mostly lacks replayability and character customization, which are paramount for a role-playing game. That concludes our review for today, ladies and gentlemen. Tune in soon for our next review.
And remember, kids, don't take candy from Moogles.